Hello and welcome to this episode of How to Be a Great GM. Well, firstly, let me show you the t-shirts are done. Finally, yes, after many months and things, they are done and they are being shipped out to those of you that participated in the competition and that managed to win. Just bear with us, we have had some changes going on, but now that that's out of the way. So, today is a review of your questions and comments over the last month of August. Can you believe it? August is done. So, without further ado, let's turn our attention to our page of letters. Firstly, for mass combat, that system that we were looking at on how to literally have big battles and not get lost. Miles Matheson writes, easiest way is to let PCs take over the mass combat, controlling platoons or units of cookie-cutter soldiers. Archers, swordsmen, chariots, cavalry, shieldsmen, siege weapons, heal bots, and so on. Each unit would have a singular attack and damage die, as well as max HP and armor class. The DM should control the opposing force, while players control the allied forces, and why not pull out the blank battle map and add a few geographical features. My argument against this is that although yes, it would certainly help you simulate a great battlefield, and yes, it might give you some great random generations of outcomes that weren't necessarily anticipated by the players or by the GM himself or herself, the problem is that this takes away all of the control from the players or from the GM having any kind of influence. It's just statistical dice rolling and unit versus unit. Yes, they can control where they go and that kind of thing, but the character's actions, the actual character's actions don't make much sense. And furthermore, what happens if some of the players aren't tactically minded? If they don't play tabletop battle games and that kind of thing? Maybe they've never heard of any of the simulators that are out there, and so they get trounced by the GM who's got a lot of experience or knowledge on how to play these kind of games. So although it is a solution and it is an option for you, personally I prefer to go the other way, of course, because it allows you far more control over the outcome of those battles than it does by simulating. Now, on the other hand, if you look at the new Starfinder system that's just come out, their space combat is grid-based with ships moving around, and it becomes a very, very similar thing to a battle map, although there's a little bit more inclusion of the players in terms of the outcome. Is that the way to go in RPGs? Are we playing a tabletop role-playing game, or are we playing a tactical battle game that one can get? I'm not sure. Anyway, that's my opinion on it. Dummy Urd wrote, the one thing that irked me for the longest time, in a fantasy setting with dungeons and mages, you would not have mass combats of thousands of people. The advantage of big bands of weak soldiers would be more than counteracted by the area of effect spells of mages. Now this opens up a whole big can of worms in terms of how fantasy works. And generally fantasy works by everybody ignoring the actual fact of the mechanics of a fantasy world. The moment we have gods that are able to manifest themselves through the powers and divine spells of their priests, the moment we have mages who can run around casting magic and things, there is a massive imbalance that suddenly happens. Now, a lot of fantasy authors tried to mitigate this by saying, oh, there's only a few magic users, those are very rare. Generally speaking, Dungeons and Dragons and the like ignore that fact, and there's a mage on every street corner peddling his wares. Well, why is he doing that rather than just using his transmutation magic to turn stuff into valuable stuff or more valuable stuff? Because the components don't necessarily weigh out, and some systems don't even have components. It opens up a whole different space of problems. So we have to rely on the fact that there are still these ideal old-fashioned medieval battles where people line up and charge, and that there are thousands of them, and that the mages for some unknown reason either tire too quickly or don't use their magic as effectively as they possibly could. Certainly a player character mage can take out a lot more combatants than one would expect, especially if they're simple little soldiers. And of course the whole idea of higher level characters going into battle, most of those soldiers should be level 1 maybe, in which case the high level characters should just wade through them. So one has to suspend that section of narrative, well, not of narrative, of mechanical belief, and replace it with the narrative imperative that our battlefield should be filled with gigantic battles and not just two mages standing opposite one another. So mass combat, generally speaking, people were engaged in the idea of running these things, and I think it went down quite well. Traps now. Traps was interesting. Lollipop Sunder wrote, I was going to make a joke about traps and gayness, but your Cockney construction grunt enthralled me with his character. Well done. I'm not entirely sure where those options were coming from, but as long as the Cockney construction grunt who enthralled you worked, well, then that trap managed to succeed, didn't it? ATM Misting wrote, why would there be waffles in the middle of the woods? It's a good question, and I myself would quite possibly fall into that trap. Yes, I would. Traps were responded to by a lot of people giving a lot of different options for traps and things, and I thoroughly enjoyed the conversations that were literally exploding around the idea of traps, pun intended. No Face the Void then wrote, what are your thoughts on home-brewed traps and riddles? Do you find it difficult to challenge a group of close friends who know you well? I always will advocate homebrew anything over pre-constructed stuff. And even if the pre-constructed stuff is going to be useful, I would still change it and add my own flair to it anyway. That's my standard response. In terms of playing with friends, when doing traps and when doing riddles, you need to be careful that you don't start setting it just for your friends. Knowing their knowledge, their understanding, their general knowledge of history and that kind of thing, don't try and use that to be against them. Rather use it so that it works for them. That way, at least, they don't have to come across these riddles and traps and things that are designed to outfox them as players, outfox as their characters. Again, the idea of homebrew is always going to triumph. Sean Rea said, or asked, or commented, or just wrote down, in terms of a campaign overall, how would you balance centerpiece traps or puzzles over fighting the boss, the big bad boss? Certainly both would be the centerpiece of a session or area. Well, yes, the trap, if it's going to be a big trap, I mean, if we're just talking normal dart traps or chasm traps and that kind of thing, they're not centerpiece. But if we're talking the end of the world, room-crushing, release the scorpions type of trap, I would usually have that set off at the beginning of the session or end the session off with it so that there is this sense of drama that they now, when they come back to playing, the players now have this problem of the trap which has now been triggered. So I would have it as a centerpiece for one session, or if you're playing for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 hours, I would try and punctuate every 3 hours with one of these things. So the trap would then lead on to the big bad. I wouldn't necessarily do the big bad first and then the trap. It kind of feels like the GM is punishing the characters for succeeding in defeating the big bad. That's my personal opinion on the matter, but I would avoid using traps after the big bad unless it's for humorous effect or it's designed that the big bad was actually in a trap all along and the whole thing is a trap, in which case then 10 points to you, because I think that makes for a very interesting story. Moving on to alignment and story. Alignment is always a prickly subject because it is so subjective and objective and there's all sorts of definitions and things. So there was a lot of commentary that raged on about whether it was applicable or not, whether it was still useful or not, and all those kind of things. Shepherd Dog 117, though, says, this brings up the question, though, what's good and evil? Well, as we discovered in the various videos that were released this month on the topic of good and evil and lawful and chaotic and neutral and everything in between, there is almost no consensus. There is almost no idea of what is good and what is evil. Generally speaking, we all agree that it actually shifts and changes depending on one's perspective, which doesn't really help a mechanical system. Oh, I use detect alignment. What are you thinking are your intentions in terms of your interaction with this person? Are they good? Are they evil? Are they chaotic? Are they neutral? And So that's an interesting problem where we have this mechanic that has a lot of things involved with it, and we have this narrative and real life experience which tells us that some people can be evil whilst trying to be good, and some people can be good whilst they themselves are inherently evil. The universe has no concept of good or evil or lawful or chaotic. It is simply the universe and it doesn't care. So, what is good and evil? My personal opinion is that this is a conversation that you need to have with your players, and you need to solidify it almost before you begin play. Alignment works as it's prescribed in the book. Alignment is not applicable, and so all spells that have any kind of effect on alignment or require a certain type of alignment are no longer applicable. And I have replaced them with detect adventure types or character types rather than etc. etc. So however you want to work that, it is something to talk to your players about and to get onto firm ground. Now, Sumandark said, my GM keeps track of alignment himself, with alignment of characters changing depending on how the GM interprets our actions. We as players don't know our alignment until we use a spell to detect them. I put this in because I thought it's a very interesting way of looking at it. Now what it says is the lawful and evil, the good and the bad, the chaotic, is subjective to the GM's interpretation. Now, since the GM technically represents the universe and everything in it, I think that is almost a fair call. The GM decides what's good and evil. Now, of course, the challenge here is the GM must communicate that to the players before sessions start, reminding them if necessary, but also the GM needs to be consistent in their application thereof and needs to have a yardstick from which to judge just what is good and evil. It's very difficult, and we all seem to think that we have the answer to it until we ourselves start to face the problem of our own good and evil and lawful and chaotic. So that's an interesting idea, and I think it's one that could work. Riddles. Riddles everybody seemed to absolutely love, and there were so many riddles posted onto the comments below. It was absolutely fantastic, and people really seem to like riddles and using them in their game, so I hope the video was inspirational from that perspective. The Stick of Boom says, a very good video. As usual. But I have a bit of a problem. I was considering adding a riddle to a Sith burial chamber in a Star Wars campaign. The problem is that Star Wars' many creatures and places can be obscure. How would one go about crafting a riddle about something more metaphysical or philosophical, and I'm adding into this, in the context of a specific setting? So with Star Wars, for example, or with Star Trek, or with 40K, or if we go into the fantasy space and you start looking at the pre-generated environments like Dragonlance or Spelljammer or Dark Sun, all those kind of things, how do you make riddles that feel as if they belong to that space, but don't require the player to have an absolute encyclopedic knowledge of that space? I could give you riddles based on South Africa that unless you were from South Africa, you really wouldn't get. And unless you were from specific groups within South Africa, you really wouldn't get. So how do you make it feel as if the riddle is appropriate to the setting, but that doesn't require setting knowledge? And that doesn't require you to set it up? Well, there are one or two ways around this. One is you can have murals and paintings where you describe these stories to the player's characters as they're working their way through the dungeon. That way, when you get to the riddle, the answer is in one of the stories that you told them. The key here is that you can't just tell them one story, you've got to tell them several stories so that you can hide the answer within that grand story. So you could use clues and things beforehand, since you have hopefully created the riddle before the players get to it, to allude to its answer. And that might make it feel as if it was more part of the setting than just a riddle that's been made up. The alternative, of course, is to allow characters to make intelligence checks and have memories of, oh, I remember there was this character whose name was Odin and he had this and he had that. That to me feels like a role solution rather than a role-playing solution. So it's tricky, and again, it's about gauging the competency of your characters, but also making sure that if you have players who are particularly wise on the setting that you are in, that you don't create a riddle that you think is difficult, but the players go, oh, that's easy. Obviously, it was Leia's left finger, whatever the case might be. Black Jim Tartars writes, what circumstances should you deny the players the answer, though? There is no point in introducing such barriers if you will always allow your players to automatically overcome them after a given amount of time, and yet the advice you give here implies to me that you should always give the answer away eventually. Now, that may have been, or that is, a failing of the way that I presented the riddles. I feel that riddles should generally be overcome. What I didn't elaborate on is that, and this was an option many of you gave already, is that if you have a riddle and your players can't get past it, there should be a violent outcome where, well, not necessarily violent, it could be a frustrating outcome as well, it could be a depressing outcome, but there is some kind of repercussion for failing in the riddle, and then that repercussion, if the players perform adequately well, if their characters perform adequately well, and they overcome that repercussion, whether it's a violent one or whether it's another kind of loyalty one perhaps, or a test of morality, those kind of things, the outcome of that should be solvable by the characters. And if not, then they go back to default with riddle. But then the riddle's too hard, and one needs to maybe look at saying, well, now that the riddle has been triggered, it changes to something else, in which case always have a backup riddle, or that the riddle has now spent its magic and dissolves in front of them, allowing them to pass through. Now, why do I advocate that? Why do I say that the characters should get past? Well, if you've got a riddle protecting the entrance to your dungeon and they can't get past it, they're going to go somewhere else. They're going to get frustrated and they're going to leave. Now, you might think, oh, well, they'll come back to this dungeon one day. Not likely. Most players will have a note saying, dungeon, possible gold inside, hard riddle, don't know answer, avoid. We'll find stuff elsewhere. So, yes, if they can't solve the riddle, throw something at them as punishment. Not punishing the players for not solving the riddle, punishment for the characters giving the wrong answer or not giving the right answer. Then, once they have defeated that, then they can move on and they can move through. So I hope that this has given you some insight into the comments below, and if you don't read the comments, I strongly suggest you do. Everyone has got so many wonderful ideas, and when you pose a question that people are interested in, they generally will answer and argue backwards and forwards and do all sorts of wonderful things and slowly unpack this remarkable game that we are all so very much in love with. So, until next time, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button if you want to see more of these kind of things. And as we dash forward into September, which is the age of spring for us down here in the Southern Hemisphere, or the auspices and the beginnings of autumn for you over there in the Northern Hemisphere, of course, think about how you can use these comments to improve your game, because they're just as much a resource as the videos that you love and that you watch. So, until next time, I wish you and yours the happiest of gaming.